Hello, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Christine Chappell, and I'm really excited to be sharing a very short talk with you on the topic of two truths and a lie about mental disorders. I am a wife, a mother, a biblical counselor, an author, but also someone who knows what it's like to be diagnosed with a mental disorder. And so this short talk is a fruit of the Lord's faithfulness in my own life and how He helped me to navigate my post-diagnosis journey, leading me to experience growth, change, and ultimately freedom from the challenging, nuanced problems I'd been experiencing for almost 15 years. Now, everybody's story is different, but the stabilizing biblical truths that God comforts and counsels us with are the same. So my goal for this talk about two truths and a lie about mental disorders is that you would walk away with a fresh perspective on processing a disorder diagnosis through a biblical lens. Truth number one, a mental disorder label describes symptom clusters. Okay, so if you've been diagnosed with a mental disorder, then that label that you have been given by a psychiatrist means that you are experiencing a group of symptoms, whether they be behavioral, cognitive, or emotional, sometimes even physical, and they group them all together in a cluster and then call it by name for easy reference. And so the labels themselves can offer us some insights to the challenges and symptoms that are being experienced by someone who is suffering. It can help even to give us words to describe the experiences, the different symptoms that are included in those clusters for the particular label that the person has been given. And also being diagnosed with a mental disorder, if that has happened to you or someone you love, can often be a catalyst for seeking out wise care and making life changes. And so those are some of the ways where it's possibly very helpful to someone who is struggling. But there are also parts of the process of being labeled with a mental disorder that don't feel so helpful. There's a quote from a psychiatrist I include in my mini book, and I love how he puts it here. The doctor writes that psychiatric labels can be an obstacle not only to the treatment process and outcome, but it can also be problematic to how the individual being labeled perceives him or herself as a person. The label is sticky and stigmatizing, hard to remove, and is unlikely to be helpful to the individual's understanding of his or her mental health problem. So the truth is, while mental disorder labels can be helpful in how they describe symptom clusters and they can lead to making informed, wise care decisions, they are in themselves limited in scope, subjective in nature, and even debated within the field of psychiatry itself. So it's important to note that a mental disorder label does not encapsulate you as a whole person, body and soul. It may describe some of the problems that you're going through, but it certainly doesn't describe your personhood. That takes us into truth number two. A mental disorder label does not define your identity. This was a really big point for me to process when I was first diagnosed with bipolar disorder too. There's real temptation to embrace a label as something more than it really is. And actually, over identifying with a psychiatric label can dramatically impact our outlook on life and the way we represent ourselves to the world. Dr. Mike Emlet has a fantastic book called Descriptions and Prescriptions. And he says that, quote, even with clear-cut medical problems, we don't say, I am diabetes or I am cancer. Why would we say, I am bipolar or I am ADHD or I am borderline, as though that is the sum of our total personhood? The temptation, he says, is for the diagnosis to be the sun around which all the rest of life orbits. But people are far more complex than a diagnosis can capture. This was a turning point for me to recognize that the label that I had been given, plus the problems that I was going through, did not define who I was as a person. Romans 8:16-17 says that for his spirit joins with our spirit to affirm that we are God's children. And since we are his children, we are his heirs. In fact, together with Christ, we are heirs of God's glory. That is my truest identity. Above and beyond any man-made label, this is my God-given status in Christ. I am a child of God, and this is a true and better label, which is then meant to inform the way that I perceive and process all of life's challenging problems, even the ones that that qualify to be included in a symptom cluster for a mental disorder label diagnosis. Another way of thinking about this is that we can view ourselves as struggling saints, or we can view ourselves as a saint who struggles. And the perspective really does make a difference, because a struggling saint sounds like you're losing, right? But a saint who struggles sounds like you've already won and you're learning how to walk in the newness of life. You're clinging to the fact that God promises to help you, to strengthen you, to establish you through this process, to conform you to the image of his son, to sanctify your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviors over time, by degrees. This is all the things that he promises to do. So a mental disorder label does not define who you are. Only God gets to do that. And he says that you are a saint. In Christ, you are a child, an adopted child, which means that you have been assigned an identity, a belonging, a purpose, a power because of your adoption through Christ into God's family. So what's the lie? Those are the two truths. What's the lie? The lie that I want to share with you today is that a mental disorder label dictates your destiny. There is the real fear when you are labeled with a mental disorder that maybe you will never be able to experience change or freedom or growth, that maybe you'll just be stuck like this forever. That is what I struggled with. But I really had to stop and consider, is this true? Is it possible that God cannot change what his word specifically and progressively promises to sanctify over time? Is his transforming grace really beyond its ability to help me? Is it possible to abide in Christ and never bear any spiritual fruit? Never, ever? Am I always going to be the person I am today? Even findings from the American Psychological Association spoke about the work of their recovery advisory committee. And in that article, I want to share a quote with you. One of the committee members said that, quote, "The idea that people actually do recover from serious mental illness is foreign to many psychologists, and therefore," this is not the quote, "I would argue foreign to many members of the general public and even sufferers themselves." Part of my story is to share with you that it's possible, and that God's timing on producing this promised transformation, this change, the spiritual fruit that he promises to develop and mature in his children, that looks all different, right? But his promises have not changed just because you've been given a label. His promises do not change just because you're struggling with a particular set of challenges, or his promises remain, because all of his promises find their yes in Christ. And so having that perspective and knowing that as a child of God, I can interpret and process the problems I'm experiencing and know that God will help me, that God is teaching me, that he can help me to learn through the power of his word. I can be transformed. We don't have to have a spirit of resignation and say, this is always how it's going to be. I can never change. Because who are we to predict the future? Who are we to say what God can or can't do with us? We just don't have that kind of authority. We don't get to tell God what he does or doesn't do in our lives. We can look to him and say, God, help. And then, God, I trust you. I trust that you are going to help me to learn how to engage these overwhelming emotions or thoughts or these addictive behaviors or whatever it is that someone may be struggling with. It's a complete perspective shift from having our faith inform the way we process our problems versus our problems inform the way that we're processing our faith. And for all that is not transformed or healed this side of heaven, we know our true destiny. We are not doomed to have a mental disorder label in perpetuity. One day, our bodies will be made new. We will be completely glorified. We will be risen. We will live in a new heavens and a new earth. So it's a lie that if you've been diagnosed with a mental disorder, then all hope for change is lost. All hope for healing or transformation is lost. It's a lie to say that you're doomed and that things can never be different for you. It's a lie that you've lost all your usefulness and purpose in God's kingdom. And while some people may continue to struggle to varying degrees with particular challenges for the rest of their lives, a mental disorder label does not mean that you have a concrete declaration over your destiny. It doesn't mean that you automatically have a lifelong condition that will never improve. You don't have to believe that lie, that this is just who I am and who I will always be. Yes, it may feel like this is true for some of us today. And yes, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy if we allow a disorder diagnosis to become the sun around which our entire world orbits. But we don't have to let that happen. you do have a choice on which perspective to believe and embrace. And to play off an expression, my friend and licensed professional counselor Beth Broom says, you don't have to believe anything that I've shared with you today, but you can. So there you have it, 2 truths and a lie about mental disorders. I hope that there was something that was helpful to you in this talk. Thanks so much for joining me today. I appreciate it.